the Trump-Pence regime has a strategy to stay in power, to hammer into place a vicious fascist program to crush basic rights, to crush the right to protest, to barrel ahead with their white supremacist, male supremacist, anti-immigrant, planet-destroying, science-denying program. And for them, they don't see this as an election, but as a rolling coup. And already they are stealing the election. People have heard Trump and Pence saying that they will not honor the results of this election if they deem those results unacceptable to them. They are ramming through their nomination and ratification of Amy Coney Barrett, a Christian theocrat, onto the Supreme Court for two reasons. One, because they are maneuvering to get the election decided on the Supreme Court, and two, because they're bound and determined to go ahead with their fascist program. They are working to suppress vote, to suppress the votes of Black and Latino people around the country. People have seen and people have been part of waiting on lines 12 hours to vote. This is what's happening right now. And this is, as I said, an unprecedentedly dangerous situation. And this is a time when, yes, people must vote, massively vote for Biden. But this is also a time when we cannot simply vote, when we cannot rely on the vote. We have to be in the streets and stay in the streets around the demand the Trump-Pence regime must go, around the demand Trump-Pence out now, Trump-Pence out for mass protest assemblies in major cities and towns across the country, in squares. We, Revolution Books here in New York and Revolution Books in Berkeley, will be out at those protests. And I urge all of you to go to refusefascism.org and find out where those protest assemblies will be happening in your local cities. So with that, I want to begin our program tonight. Tonight's program is one of our series of emergency events entitled 60 Defiant Days, Talks, Dialogue, Performance in the Name of Humanity, Trump-Pence, out now. And the purpose of this programming is to deepen people's understanding of the enormity of what we are facing. That is a fascist regime that is moving ferociously to impose full-out fascism, to heighten people's resolve, to stop this, to be in the streets along with voting, and to raise people's sights to the revolution that humanity needs. And I want to introduce our guests now with that introduction. We're very happy, very excited to have with us Anthea Butler. Anthea Butler was the initiator of the scholar strike that took place on September 8th and September 9th. She is the chair of religious studies, an associate professor of religion and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And her current projects include two books, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. That'll be out in the spring of 2021. And I want to give people a heads up that they can get that book when it's available at Revolution Books. And if you tell people that you watch this dialogue, you will get a special discount when the book comes out. And we are going to have Anthea at the store when that becomes possible. And she is also bringing out a book entitled Reading Race, How Publishing Created a Lifeline for Black Baptists in Post-Reconstruction America. Anthea, we're very excited to have you with us from Philadelphia. And I wanted to start our conversation by asking about the scholar strike.
Sure.
People watching may have participated in it, heard of it. It was covered on CNN. It was reported on in various journals, including Inside Higher Education. And of course, it was something that was going all across the social media. So why don't you tell us about how the scholars strike came about, what inspired it, what its aims were, and we can also get into what actually happened on those 2 days. So tell us about the background of the scholars strike.
Sure thing. Thanks, Raymond, for having me. I'm really glad to be here tonight. Scholar strike actually happened, it was a fluke. And the fluke happened the night that the NBA was in the bubble and they decided that they were not going to play because we had had another shooting in Wisconsin. And they decided that they would not play, and this created a huge furor that night. And I basically said, well, if the NBA could do it, why can't we? Why can't scholars do the same thing? And I just said, maybe it's time for us to strike. And people started responding to me on Twitter and saying, let's do this, let's do this. And one of the professors, Kevin Gannon, who's in Iowa, said that he would help. And we got together that night, and in a Zoom call of about 45 minutes, we put together, and I came up with the name Scholar Strike. And we started doing this, and we just figured that we would do, I thought of it like what you did in the 60s, teach-ins to help people understand about racial injustice, anti-racism, police brutality, all of those kinds of things that we've been seeing happening through years throughout America, and nobody's been talking about it. So we started off and just asked people to sign up. We had a little Google sign up sheet, and within 24 hours, we had 600 people. And by the time we got to right the day after Labor Day is when we started, September 8th and 9th, we had over 5,000 people who had signed up for Scholar Strike. So that was really something.
5,000.
5,000, over 5,000. Now, I have to tell you that I don't even know how many people actually participated, because this was sort of one of the things that we decided was that we'd be a clearinghouse. We would help you have materials. We would give you, some banners and things to use, but that we just told people, you either do something in your classes if you have a collective bargaining agreement that you can't, strike, formally. Maybe you do something in your class. If you could strike formally, then figure out what you're going to do that day for your students. And we decided that the thing that we could do, we could facilitate, is to have videos basically on racial injustice, policing, et cetera. And so we have a YouTube page called Scholar Strike, of course, where we have over 50 videos from various academics talking about these subjects that people could either show to their classes or to watch themselves. So it was a huge success. I was actually really surprised, I have to say, because when you start these things up, you don't know how they're going to generate themselves. But we had we have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter feed, we have a great email list, we have a web page. And although we've kind of been in stasis for the last month and a half, I see that we'll probably do some things in the future, because I think there are going to be a lot of issues, whoever is in power, come after November the 3rd, so that we can start to press for some justice and do that as academics. So yeah, so I think that's where we are right now, and that's how we got started. Oh, and I should say one more thing, which was really important. This actually crossed borders and it went into Canada, and there was a Canada Scholar Strike as well, and they had their Scholar Strike on September 9th and 10th, because that was the day, the 8th was a day off for them, and so the first day of classes was the 9th, and they did that, and so they had a whole slate of events and things as well. So we were really pleased to see how far things went. And that was, I was ecstatic, actually, to tell you the truth. I think there was a lot of pent up
Well,
need.
Anthea, tell us more about what actually happened. What were some of the kinds of activities, and also, more specifically, some of the YouTubes that have gone up. What were the topics,
Mhm.
and then what was the involvement of students in this in
Okay.
relation to the professors and the
Yeah.
scholars, and were there any places where it was more, it was more of a phenomenon than in other places?
See, that's going to be the hard part. Let me answer that but last part first. I have to tell you that I didn't even know half of the things that happened until afterwards, okay? Because basically people reported on them in student newspapers. And because of where we are right now with the pandemic, some schools are in, some are people doing virtual things, some are half and half. So that was kind of hard to sort of gather up all that information. What we do know is that we had over 100 media kind of hits, in terms of student newspapers and things like that covering it. Basically, what we had in terms of events were different kinds of things. Some people went a very low route and said, I'm going to do something in my class, and it wasn't university wide. Other places like the University of Arizona did larger events and they ran into problems with the administration, which is probably something we should talk about in a minute, because I think that's a really important piece about talking about scholars and activism is the relationship to the administration and the provost, the president and deans and all that kind of stuff. One of the things that happened was that, people had poetry readings, either people had teach-ins, people did videos. Some of the videos that we had included, we had one from Brittany Cooper. We had a video that was about, medievalists and race, which was really very interesting and actually really spoke to some of the issues about white supremacy right now, because a lot of white supremacists really are very invested in medieval studies and Christianity in Europe. And so that was a good one. Personally, from my own institution, we had a huge one about policing and policing at Penn and other institutions in West Philadelphia, where the University of Pennsylvania is. We actually have 5 police forces, if you can believe that, 5 for this very small space. We have a police force at Drexel, we have a police force at Penn, we have a police force at the University of Sciences. There's a couple other ones in addition to the Philadelphia police force, okay? And the school, the local independent school district police force. So we've got policing everywhere around us. And the students at Penn came up with a really great video that you can see on the Scholar Strike website about Penn policing, and also, different things about STEM, all kinds of subjects. So where race hits any subject that was in the college curriculum, we probably have something about it.
Yeah. Listen, since you mentioned it, racism and medieval studies,
Hmm.
this is, people can look at the YouTube on this, but there was an article in the New York Times about it as well.
Yeah.
And I just thought you should elaborate a little more on that because, on first blush, you would say, wow, medieval studies, that's just, some esoteric, off the
No,
radar,
not at
area
all.
of speaking of
Not at all.
scholasticism, right? But
Yeah.
no, au contraire. So I thought it would be interesting for people to hear about this because it is a kind of flank of fascist influence on the campuses, and it
Yes, it is.
represents, part of
Well, it's not
this
even just the campuses, it's the
ideological
Proud
artillery
Boys.
of the fascists. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not even just campuses, it's the Proud Boys, it's the, sort of the ley line of all of this. I'm gonna take you back a little bit and to bring it forward to explain. If you go back a few years to think about what happened in Utoya and the murders of everybody in Utoya, one of the things that happened there, that was put up in the manifesto was all about the Crusades and how Islam was bad and that Christianity was gonna fix all of this and do everything. And I think that was the first place where people started seeing that, information about the Crusades, medievalists, King Arthur, all of this stuff, right, was involved with white supremacy because in their minds, this is the height of white civilization, and that Christianity is the white man's religion and it's for them, and that is the bringer of culture and life and social being. Okay. So, and I want to make sure I pronounce her name right because it's probably the most watched video that we had. Dr. Mary Rambram Olam, who's at the University of Toronto. Her title of her video was Medieval Studies, White Supremacy, and Black Lives Matter. And, I had to actually stop the comments on her video because she was getting hit from all sides, and especially people actually writing from Europe, to cuss her out essentially in the comments about what she said about white supremacy and medieval studies. It's been a very white field, and it doesn't need to be because the medieval world is not all white. And I think that everybody has this idea that, when folks marched off to Jerusalem to go back and recapture it, that there were no Africans in Spain, there were no Africans in Britain, wrong. There were no Africans in France, wrong. There were no people of color anywhere, and it was just white haired, blue eyed Aryans doing everything. And that's not the truth. And so these tales have been made up to sort of, put a kind of a history that's been written about what white supremacists think is the right history, and how to write everybody else out of history as being, somehow uncivilized and all of that. So I think that was a really important video that we had among all the rest of them that could help sort of discount some of this, first of all, and to deal with some present day things that we see in terms of how white supremacists use things like Celtic crosses and others as their imagery, when in fact these things are devoid of these kinds of racial connotations that they put on them.
Yeah. I want to come back to evangelical racism
Mhm.
in a minute, but I'd like to hear, and to enable the audience to hear a little more about the strike. For those who are just tuning in, as we say, coming online, uh, this is Revolution Books. This is one of our series, 60 Defiant Days at Revolution Books. In the name of humanity, the Trump-Pence regime must go. And we're very delighted and excited to have with us Anthea Butler, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the interim chair of religious studies there. And she was the initiator of the scholar strike. And then a co-initiator came on board, right? Kevin
Yes,
Gannon.
Kevin
I'm
Gannon,
hoping
Dr. Kevin Gannon, yes.
Kevin and friends are listening. And we're talking about the experience of that strike and the racial upheaval, electoral upheaval, and escalating fascism.
Yeah.
So, Anthea, what about the response of the administrations where these took, these events took place? Was there any retaliation? I did hear of something in the
Mhm.
University of Mississippi. Was this something that was welcomed by the administrations, this
Yeah.
participation? And
Well,
then what kind of involvement, again, uh, from the students? I realize these were, difficult circumstances with the pandemic and the remoteness of, remote transmissions, but um,
yeah. Yeah. Well, I think let me talk about people who got penalized first. And I just missed this, and I just looked it up right now while I was talking to you because I was thinking about her. Dr. Wendy Moore, who was at Texas A&M University, she's an associate professor of sociology. They put a formal reprimand and a 2-day suspension without pay for her participation in scholar strike. And so I want to just get that out there right now because I would like to be able to do something for her, because I think this is ridiculous in terms of, how professors are being attacked for, taking up for themselves and trying to make a world a better place, actually, and being able to exercise their First Amendment rights of free speech. So I think this is a real problem. Now, in the case of um, her problem, I believe they have a collective bargaining agreement, and they said that she violated the collective bargaining agreement. The thing that happened at Ole Miss was that basically another professor, who's an anthropology professor, whose name I'm forgetting right now, and I'll look that up for a second, he was also attacked too. And they actually sent 2 agents to his house to check him out because he had been participated in the strike and threatened to take his job. For the most part, however, most administrations understood what this was about and wanted to be of assistance. So we had, other deans and things like that. My own university didn't say a word, which was fantastic, and, let things go and let people be able to strike. But I think what your listeners should understand, and what I think is really important here, and it's not just about the strike, but that there's a concerted effort to keep university professors from speaking out. There's a concerted effort to keep people from doing talking about things that conservatives don't think are right. So you have things like Turning Point USA, which attack faculty through students that are actually on campus. You have Campus Reform, which are other organizations that write about what professors say and distort what they say in order to create a hubbub and try to get people jobs taken away from them. And that's actually even bigger than the strike. This has been going on for years. I've been attacked by them. And I think what your listeners should understand is that while everybody seems to think that the university is some liberal bastion, there are liberals and conservatives there. But what is happening is that conservatives want to stifle speech. And so this was an opportunity for conservative institutions like Ole Miss and Texas A&M. And there were people who also got reprimanded by deans and I believe the provost at the University of Arizona for participating in the strike. And they didn't bother to go look at what we had written up and how we said, you know, if you can't strike, you can do other kinds of things. They didn't bother to look at that. They just said, oh, they must be striking. This is horrible. And I think this is a broader way in which people are being forced to not say anything and being threatened with their jobs, being threatened with tenure, being threatened with different kinds of things. And so I think it's really important for us to pay attention to what's happening with that and to, you know, understand that some people put a lot on the line for that. And I think that's unfair.
Yeah, we should talk a bit more about the fascist assault on the university and, what is happening. There has been an escalation, of these right-wing reactionaries. It started earlier, as you said, the Turning Point, David Horowitz has
Yeah.
been doing this, calling on, students to investigate radical professors, tape record, their lectures, distort them. And, on some campuses, like at the University of California, Berkeley, you had Ben Shapiro coming on, this is, very recently.
Hmm.
And, Berkeley is Berkeley, right? This
Yeah.
is a campus that, has traditionally and historically and very importantly been a real sort of seedbed for radical defiant ideas and in campus activism, radical revolutionary student upsurge. And they are feeling the wind behind their backs with Trump in power to
Yeah.
be doing this. And I should say that Revolution Books in Berkeley was physically assaulted by
Wow.
some of these MAGA
Yeah.
people, Make America Great Again people, who came, and this was in conjunction with, this whole right-wing assault that you're describing. So I think this is, something that we should explore a little, while we're on this topic of, the attack on dissent and critical thinking, and on the campuses. And it is taking certain forms with Trump, issuing these directives to remove funding, federal funding for the 1619
Hmm.
project. This was a curriculum program, that
Yeah.
has come off the special supplement in the New York Times that was
Hmm.
digging into the actual history of this country, that the founding date should be 1619, when the first, enslaved person was brought to
Hmm.
these shores. But there's been this assault on, this kind of, truthful historical telling and critical race theory, other, intellectual, trends and disciplines that have had a certain initiative on the campuses and are now, facing this kind of attack. I wanted to know if you had more to say about that.
Yeah, no, well, actually, I have a lot to say about this. I think that this is a moment in which we need different kinds of things happening. One is, let me talk about it from the standpoint of a professor. Professors need to understand that your classroom is not this safe space where you can say everything you want anymore. It is a space in which you don't know if somebody's spying on you or not. And especially now when we're having to be online and you're in front of your students in front of a screen for most of us instead of being in person, that means that the words that you say, even if you're just teaching something like history, for instance, can be distorted and used against you. And I can't even begin to tell you about how many people have been attacked and lost their jobs or have been threatened because they said something that a conservative student who was involved with Turning Point USA or campus reform said something. So I'll give you an example from my own career that'll make it very easy. I wrote a piece back when George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin that is God a white racist, right? And this is a name of a book that was back from the 1970s, 1970 exactly, by a Black philosopher. And they took the article to say that I was saying that God was a racist and that white people were all terrible and everything. And they ran this huge campaign against me. I had death threats. I got talked about by Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity twice. So you know that's a good week when somebody talks about you like that. And basically, they called this university relentlessly. This is what they do. They get people all ginned up about the supposed thing that you said, and then have people attack you and threaten you and universities usually cave in. This is where the administrators come in. So the administrators get upset because they just want everything to stop, and they try to reprimand the professor. In my particular case, the University of Pennsylvania has been really great because they believe in freedom of speech and the freedom of speech of their faculty. So they stood behind me. But I can point people to a recent case from Professor Burnett in Texas, where she said something about Donald Trump online during the thing. And campus reform has been attacking her for the last 3 or 4 weeks. Her president wrote something about her. They put it online. It's just been relentless. And so I think people need to understand that these are well organized things, institutions and forums that come against the institutions in order to attack professors, to keep people from teaching the kinds of things that we need to know during this kind of time of rising fascism and all of the other things, the isms that we're having to deal with right now. And I think it's really important also to know that, for those of us who get death threats and everything like that, it's not just simply being an activist and not doing anything. It's actually putting your life on the line to be able to talk and teach about things that are important, like race. I mean, the kinds of things that have happened with the 1619 Project just let you know that everybody is really upset about the fact that we actually want to tell some truths about America. And it's no surprise that historians are often the ones that are attacked, because there's a mythology here in America about what slavery was and about what white people have done. And that when you start to break down that mythology with truth, people get really upset.
I think it's so important what you're saying, both, bringing to people the reality of what is happening to more outspoken,
Mm.
scholars, people that are working in certain disciplines. And, it's no accident that a lot of the work that focuses on, the foundations of America in slavery and genocide against against the Native American peoples, that this kind of scholarship is coming under attack from the highest levels of
Yeah,
the, of the country, from
yeah,
Trump, himself. And I think this really underscores why, the, the most important battle that we have to be waging right now, the most important, the most urgent battle, for all who hate injustice, who stand for the cause of the betterment of humanity and the protection of the planet, is to drive this regime from power, because, it is escalating all of these assaults and giving legitimacy to all of these right-wing, forces, and backing, and actually using the instruments of the state, in this case, on the 1619 Project, to withdraw federal funding and
yeah,
financing, and also to be coddling these and egging on, these thugs who are coming onto campuses, who are making those phone calls to people in the dead of night, threatening them, who are coming to Revolution Books in Berkeley and smashing windows. This is what's been happening under this regime. And, they're stepping up the whole level of repression. We've seen what they're doing, what Trump, is calling on, with the use of these paramilitaries, to quash, protest, and, and celebrating the police, the very police. The scholar strike was touched off, right, by the shooting in Kenosha, right?
yeah,
Jacob
exactly,
Blake's murder.
exactly. Yeah.
And, and then Trump goes to Kenosha and is, hugging the
And
police for doing a fine job, right?
exactly. And
So,
people are raising money for the kid that shot the two protesters that were there. I mean, I think you have to understand where we are right now. But I want to say something really important. And I think your listeners need to understand this. This is not just about Trump, okay? Because honestly, these things were going on during the Obama administration. It's
that's right.
just that everybody thought that everything was going to be okay. And then when you got a real white supremacist in power, people felt emboldened. And so the kinds of attacks and things that a lot of us experience, they started in the Obama administration because people were upset that you had a Black president. They've been going on for a long time. It's just that they were underground. Trump has emboldened everybody to come above ground and to be out there and to be bold, because they know they will be protected by the Justice Department and everyone else. So it would not behoove us to think that this just started happening, 4 years ago in 2016. It's been going on a lot earlier before that. I always like to remind people that the day that Trump came down the escalator, what happened the next day? The next day, the Charleston shooting happened. and 9 African Americans died in the Emmanuel AME church the day after. And so that to me, it shows you that the way in which this has gone out and spread is not just about a thing that's happening now, but it's a thing that's always been happening. And that in the, since 2008, we've seen a rise in hate crimes, we've seen a rise in white supremacists, we've seen a rise in all of this stuff where the Justice Department talked about this, but because now we have a Justice Department that actually works for the president rather than works for the people, we can't really trust them to do anything either. So it's not just about, thinking about what will happen and getting Trump and Pence out. It's about rooting out something that's much deeper in this country that is not going to go away even if you vote those two guys out.
Yeah, this is absolutely right, what you're saying. I mean, and what's happening under the Trump regime is two things. One, the horrific escalation of all of these assaults, that you're talking about, and the legitimization, in a way that has not been the case before, in terms of giving backing to these reactionary thugs, the ways in which the police are being extolled, and a whole police state is being built up,
Yeah.
on a scale that hadn't existed before. But it's very important, here at Revolution Books, we get into how it is the system of capitalism, imperialism that has produced Trump. He didn't come out of nowhere. And I
Exactly.
actually want to talk about your work on evangelical racism, because you talk about the roots of this white supremacist, and misogynistic movement, and how that has its roots in the history of this country, and now it is in power and is seeking to secure power. But the point about this didn't start out of nowhere, and
No.
has deep roots in the history of this country. But there is this qualitative change that's taken place with
Mhm.
Trump, and that is the fact that we have an out and out fascist regime, a white supremacist in the White House,
Yeah.
openly not only embracing but promoting, projecting, and they have an agenda, a genocidal racist agenda, that involves everything from what they're doing on the border to immigrants, the caging, the child separation, and then the whole plan, right, to step up the policification of society. And this spills over into the academy, and we've been talking about that front of attack. So here at Revolution Books, we do get into how
Yeah.
this is a deeper problem, but we're facing the immediacy of a regime that's seeking to muster all the forces at its disposal, the state apparatus, to secure its fascist rule and to go forward with a horrible fascist program. And that's going to affect every corner of society and life. And I
Mhm.
thought at this point, and I want to at the later come back to the question of the university and the role of the intellectual in this in this period, and whether the university is going to be a zone of resistance or a zone of compliance, in a period like this where the stakes are so high. But I wanted to get to since you touched on, some of the roots of this, I want to get to your work on evangelical
Mhm.
racism.
Yeah.
And I would really commend to the attention of the audience this article that you wrote. You can get it online, and the title of it is a very provocative one. White evangelicals love Trump and aren't confused about why. No one should be.
Yeah.
And why don't you talk about that? The
They
significance of
love
that
Trump.
title. Yeah,
They love Trump because he's racist, and
yeah,
they're racist. I mean,
right.
it's very simple. I mean, I think, evangelicals, my book is about a different kind of story about evangelicals. You have lots of books about evangelicals. Frances Fitzgerald had a big, bestseller about evangelicals. But the fact of the matter is that everybody in her book was white. And she just talked about it in terms of whiteness and in terms of, political power, and didn't really talk about what evangelicals did. And what my book, White Evangelical Racism, is about this history of racism and evangelicalism that has compelled both their moral beliefs and their political beliefs. And so if we go back to look at slavery, how they thought about African Americans and enslaved people, in terms of what they thought that they were inferior about scripture, to where we look at Billy Graham and his, dubious relationship with Martin Luther King Jr., to the ways in which the religious right really didn't come about because of abortion, but it came about because they didn't want to have to give up their segregationist schools like Bob Jones University, and were mad because they were forced to integrate and have to pay taxes if they didn't integrate, right? So these are the things that brought all of these people together. And so when you got Ronald Reagan and his support of people like Jerry Falwell Sr., then you begin to see this massive coming together under the guise of we're pro-life and we want to make sure that we have good schools and everything else. But in fact, there's a program underneath this that is designed to keep white men in power and everybody else subject to their authority. That's first. And then secondarily, to keep people of color in a certain kind of religious space so that they don't have any power at all. And so I think we can see this even in the 21st century with George W. Bush and his compassionate conservatism, the ways in which he gave money to Black churches in the hopes that they would ignore certain things going on. And we see this with the rise of President Trump and his evangelical sidekick, Mike Pence, who have, garnered 80% of the vote. And I suspect that in 2 weeks, they're then going to get at least 75% of the evangelical vote, because they're not leaving them, because they've been able to give them, all kinds of things, including 3 Supreme Court justices, and they're about to get the 3rd one. So I think that if we begin to think about this history of evangelicals and their relationship to race and politics, then you see a different picture than these people who pretend to be very pious and say they don't want power, but in fact they do want power, and they have aligned themselves with Donald Trump so that they can remain and stay in power.
Yeah. The article talks about, the roots of this, white supremacist Christian fundamentalism, going back, to the period of slavery. And maybe you could say a few things about that in terms of some historical,
Oh yeah.
insight.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the stories I have in the book is about a lynching that happens after Reconstruction, that happens in a church out in Mississippi, where it happens on a Sunday. A white woman accuses a Black man of raping her, and it's a Sunday, and so they try him in the square of the town, but they say, well, it's Sunday. We should not hang him on the regular lynching tree. We're going to hang him in the back of the church. And so that's where they end up lynching him. But I mean, this whole relationship between slavery, it's best described as they use biblical stories. So the curse of Ham is to say that Black people were supposed to be enslaved. And that's what they use to say that Black people should remain in slavery, that, slavery was a gift from God, and that this was the way that people would become Christianized. And so that it would be better for them to be enslaved by white people, because basically Black people didn't have enough sense to know how to take care of themselves. And you can look at Frederick Douglass and look at his account and his narrative of how the worst slave master he ever had was a Christian slave master. It wasn't the slave master who wasn't Christian; it was a Christian slave master who would beat people unmercifully. So I think we start to look at these things, and where evangelicals have told a story about themselves that they are the abolitionists and everything. That was true. They were abolitionists, but many of them were slaveholders. You don't have the kinds of churches you have right now unless you had slavery. Why do you have Southern Baptists? Because they broke up with Northern Baptists because they wanted to keep slavery. So you have the Southern Baptist Convention and you have the American Baptists. Same thing with the Presbyterians. Same thing with the Methodists. It's a thing, and they all broke up over slavery. So I think we disabuse ourselves of the notion that all of this didn't drive apart religion too, because it did.
Yeah. You know, Bob Avakian has written an article entitled "Bob Avakian is the Revolutionary Leader," who is the architect of a whole new framework for human emancipation, the new communism. And this is the scientific method and approach to understand and change the world and to make a revolution, to change everything, to free all of humanity and to dig up the roots of white supremacy, male supremacy, to put an end to all exploitation and oppression. And he's written an article entitled "Vice President Pence, fundamentalist, fanatic, crucial force in the fascist regime. And in this article, he says two things, he says many things, but I wanted to highlight two. He says, it is Christian fundamentalism that is the hardcore and driving force of this regime. And along with Pence, this regime is full of Christian fundamentalist fanatics in powerful positions, including Attorney General Barr, Secretary of State Pompeo, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, and many others. So there is this, this alliance between between Trump and sort of the fascist that he is, and this Christian fundamentalism. And right now the combination of these Christian theocrats, their moves right now on the Supreme Court, that Trump is moving to get this through quickly, and the moves to steal the election, this is very critical to their whole strategy to secure power. And in this article, Bob Avakian quotes the African-American theologian Hubert Locke. And Locke was referencing an earlier scholar named James Luther Adams, who made the point that American fascism would not come wearing SWAT stickers and brown shirts. The American variety would come carrying crosses and chanting the Pledge of Allegiance. And and this is what's embodied in this regime. And I thought that your article, gives a lot of important background, and we're looking forward to your book, on this. And I don't know if that there is an actual theocratic program that is part of this regime, right? Yeah. Which is completely, this is something that has not been part of previous conservative Republican administrations. Well, this is a whole leap.
This is where I would say this to you. You think it hasn't been, but it has been. It just hasn't been noticeable to you until now. Yeah. And this is the point that I try to make with people, is that these people have been around for years. Let me just give you one example of what nobody paid attention to this week that you should have paid attention to. There is a big organization that's been around for almost 50 years called the Council for National Policy. It's made up of both politicians and religious people. And this week, some of their materials got out into the web. You can find this out if you just put Council for National Policy on Twitter. You can see their whole list of people who were members, because this has been very secretive. They have a meeting every summer. They get together, they start to plan and think about the things that they're going to do and put forth as policies that they want to see happen in America. And, while this sounds all shadowy and shady and sounds like it's a conspiracy theory, the actual fact is that they've been able to, really, how do I want to put this, really influence lots of politicians. They have tons of money. There are people who funnel money into this, like the Koch brothers and others, who really want to make sure that these kinds of people get into power. And so if you're going to understand the web of everything that happens, you can look at that piece, which I think is probably a really good piece. But if you want to understand this, you need to understand a 50-year arc about what the project has been. And this is where I say, Democrats have been lazy, because the Republicans are always on their game and they always know the thing that they're getting at. And since 1964, when they had a massive loss, this has been a rebuilding project about what we can do and how can we get into power. And the upsets about not having prayer in school, having to be in school with Black people, and Brown versus Board of Education, all of these things have forwarded into kind of this funneling of their power and influence in places like the Council of National Policy and others. You can think about the organizations like Focus on the Family, or you could think about Family Research Council and all these things, where ostensibly they've talked about the family. But it's not just about the family, it's about influencing political decisions so that women can't get safe gynecological care or get abortions. All of these kinds of things are really important, and they all link in together. So to say that now is the time that they're thinking about a theocracy, they've been thinking about a theocracy for 50 years.
Yeah, I misspoke. I really want to thank you for elaborating and giving that background. I misspoke because what I meant to say is that it's with this regime that they feel that they have the ability to actually go whole hog, to implement this theocratic project. I mean, I It's one of those
It's
times where
always been there.
yeah, it's been, and this is something, that Avakian has also been writing on. He's been doing, analysis of this for several decades. But, there is a sort of from the Nixon, I mean, there's the roots of it, as you point out to in your article, going back to, this is, from the battle over slavery to the present. This is, this, white supremacist Christian fundamentalism,
Mhm.
theocracy, this has, been part of that whole church movement that you're describing, and it goes through changes and quantum jumps, and from Nixon through, you have Reagan and the Bushes, and especially George Bush, it takes another leap.
Yeah.
And some of its essential litmus test issues and the codes, and and where it seeks to make breakthroughs, and is around the question of abortion in particular, the attack on gay rights. And there's a whole underlying dynamic at work in which a section of the ruling class, represented by these fascist Trump in power, feel that the way to hold this country together right now, and to solve its international problems, and to deal with the big demographic changes
Yeah.
the labor force in society, the diversity, is to impose this full out fascist theocratic program. So I really appreciate the background that you were giving. I was, I was not, speaking accurately when I made that point. I was talking about the fact that they are now poised, to make this leap that was not being made, that is to the full out fascism and
Mhm.
theocracy. So maybe we could, I wanted to move on, to, come back, if we could,
Mhm.
to the situation on the campuses right now.
Yeah.
And I wanted, there's a real challenge before us, and we touched on this in
Mhm.
terms of the assault on critical thinking and dissent. And I'd like to hear you speak about how you see, in this period of racial upheaval, electoral upheaval, and escalating fascism, speaking to others, professors and intellectuals, how do you see the role of the intellectual in a period of such high stakes, where we
Yeah.
have a, what American is called a demented fascist bully with his finger on nuclear
Yeah.
weapons? How do you see the role of intellectuals in a period like this?
I want to add one thing to that because I think that Avakian could not have predicted that we would have a pandemic.
Yeah,
And so this changes everything because basically you and I are on Zoom right now, right? And we're hopefully broadcasting out to Facebook and other places. I think that the role of the intellectual as an activist right now is a very interesting one because in some ways we have a bigger platform to be able to get out
yeah,
if you're in the right spaces and you can get the message out. On the other hand, it makes it a lot harder because on most campuses you can't get together and have a march. You can't get together and do things that you would normally do. You can't, when we were doing Black Lives Matter things at Penn, a few years ago, we had a die-in, in the middle of the street at 34th and Walnut. Can't do that now because we don't have we're not formally having classes, right? So it's a problem, I think, to not have professors and students together. And so the kinds of activism that you have to engage in where everybody scoffed at social media, that's where it happens. I think that's why, to bring it back to the beginning, that's why Scholar Strike worked because we were so disparate and far apart. And then people who were on campuses could do things, but people who weren't on campuses could do things, right? So I think there's actually a big opportunity right now for scholars to get their voices out there. But I think that means some different kinds of retooling. And let me just talk about that quickly as we run up to a close. I think one thing for scholars is that you have to think about that the old paradigms and the ways in which you do things at the university don't work anymore. So here's what I'll say. If you want to write a journal article about something that's an activist thing, that'll take 3 years for it to come out. And it might take longer now because they can't even print the journal because of the pandemic, right? So you need to start thinking about how do you write for the public? How do you get your work? How do you get things out there? How do you engage with the broader public outside of the university? Because I think that's crucial for any scholar activist that you need to be involved with people on the ground who are doing things, whether that's Black Lives Matter or anybody else who's doing activism, climate change, you need to be involved with people who are out there who are real activists doing this every day for a living. Okay. So that's number one. I think second, that we have to think about the kinds of things that we are teaching and how to retool. One of the things that happened in Scholar Strike was that a lot of people were watching the videos that got put up, and they said, I didn't know about this, I didn't know about this, and they're coming from different areas in the university. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to start learning about ethnicity and race and gender and sexuality, and to start making these things not a sidebar, but part and parcel of our academic work. It might not be an everyday thing, but you should at least be able to familiarize yourself with some of these issues, because your students are going through things and you need to know what they're going through too. I think the third thing, and actually the most important thing, is to figure out how we get buy-in from institutions. Institutions are in a strange place right now, because universities and colleges are trying to figure out how much money they're going to have, because they're not making the same kind of revenues. And those of us who've been involved in the university know that for the last 30 to 40 years, and actually within the last 20, it has become more corporatized. It's more of a corporate entity as opposed to an educational entity. And so the universities don't want to muddy up the waters. And right now, because of the pandemic, they're losing millions of dollars because they're not getting dorm revenues, they're not getting food revenues, they're not getting all these different kinds of revenues. And so what I think we're going to see is a real shift in terms of how universities work. And this could be a good time for activists to start to think about ways in which they can influence universities to change. Because, quite frankly, none of them want a riot on their campus. None of them, not all of them, want people who do ethnic studies. The jobs that are out there this year are all about ethnic studies and race and all of these things. And so the universities know that they have to retool for a new population. And to be honest, they're weary of Trump too. They're tired because so many rules have changed. Title IX rules have changed. All these rules have changed. They don't want to have to deal with all of this. And so they're, whether or not they want to admit it, they're invested in not having a Trump Pence regime for the next 4 years either. They know, because they're tired of everything that they've had to do in the last 4 years, and the kinds of things that they've had to respond to, like the immigration laws that Trump has tried to put in, different other kinds of things with changing the rules about, sexual abuse on campuses and things like that. So I think there's some ways in which, whether or not you believe it, that universities themselves as institutions don't want to see another 4 years of Trump and Pence either. And they have different reasons why. But the pandemic is the X factor in all of this, because we don't know what's going to happen. And so I think that that's going to really affect all the rest of the things that we want to do, because the pandemic offers opportunities for those who want to create upheaval, but it also creates opportunities for those of us who want to see change.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're pointing to about, the activism and the teaching and, the various, aspects of, what it means to be, speaking, relevantly and urgently, to the times, is very important. But, you mentioned people don't want another 4 more years of Trump. This is true, but the Trump Pence forces, this fascist regime is not going to voluntarily step off the stage, and quit.
Yeah.
And, getting back to the beginning, they've announced, in no uncertain terms that they, are not committed to the peaceful transfer, of power. And, this is why we're facing this extremely acute situation. And the points you were making earlier with the Democratic Party, conciliating this and having presided over, the very, conditions and been part of the whole system of rule in this society that has given rise, to Trump, Pence. But there's a split among them right now. But the Democrats are not prepared to go into the streets, not prepared to even, challenge. They've already said, Biden has said, well, the election will happen, we'll win, and then, I'm your president. And this is not the case. And we saw, Dianne Feinstein just, I don't know if you saw the
I saw it. It
here.
was disgusting.
She was embracing I'm saying the white supremacist,
Yeah.
Lindsey Graham. What a wonderful, moment this was, for bipartisan consensus. And that's why we cannot rely on the Democrats. We can't rely on voting alone. We have to vote for Biden. But I think what this means, it just emphasizes that, the university is not going to be the same place. It's
No.
coming under the assault. You gave, background history before. We've talked about, what has been the scene, but, they are going to go to a whole new level of, of regimentation, nazification of the university, going after, professors. They're going to have, institutional, resources to do that,
Yeah.
and to intimidate, to bully. And, and already, as I said, the attack on the 1619 project, is a, sort of a warning sign,
Yeah.
of where they want to go with this. So I do think that, I would, let our, our viewing, audience know that, uh, there is this movement to drive out the Trump-Pence regime. People are going into the streets under the, under the unifying demand of Trump-Pence out now. And tomorrow, there are going to be these mass protest assemblies. People should go to refusefascism.org. And I think students, one of the, one of the things you, mentioned in your, the materials for this, for the scholar strike was the inspiration of the teach-ins of the 1960s. We need a lot more ferment and,
Yeah.
and radical revolutionary activism on the campuses. This is not the case. Now, the pandemic is an important, phenomenon here that puts real constraints on people, and
Yes, it
you
does.
address this. But on the other hand, people are, going into the streets. They did over the summer, June and July. That was not remote and virtual, although there was, social media that was playing an important role in building that. But people took to the streets, and we have to draw inspiration from that, at a moment like this, when, tens and hundreds of thousands and millions, were confronting the enormity of police murders of Black people. And, and there was a sea change in society in terms of people speaking about institutional racism in a way that was not, part of
Yeah.
the discourse before. So that now we're facing, another challenge, and, we have to be, going into the streets, learning from the examples of, the summer, South Korea, when they drove, a regime from power, Puerto Rico, and, the stakes could not be higher. I do want to let people know, on the level of public intellectuals and scholars, there is a pledge of resistance that has been signed by Noam Chomsky, by Cornel West, and it's called "We Pledge, in the Name of Humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. The Trump-Pence regime must go." And it says, "We do not comply with a regime putting targets on the backs of Black, brown, and Native people, denying women control of their bodies, forcing LGBTQ people back into the closet. We do not accept a society ruled by hate and bigotry, ignorance and brutality, demeaning and cursing other peoples and countries, and threatening them with destruction. Former years, I'm jumping ahead. We will not worship the flag or accept a theocracy. We will not become collaborators on a march to a racist genocide. We will not hand the future to scorchers of the planet. We pledge our determination to prevail over a regime that imperils the people of the world and the earth itself. We pledge to stay in the streets, overcoming uncertainty until this American fascism is brought to a halt. So this is a pledge that, if people out there have not signed it or are not familiar with it, they can go to refusefascism.org. As I said, it's been signed by Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, the Grammy Award-winning, musician, composer, Arturo O'Farrell, a number of actors, poet Jessica Care Moore. So, the stand of public intellectuals at a time like this, and this call for people to be in the streets and to stay in the streets at this moment that you have been describing in its manifestations on the campuses. And at the same time, you've dug into the roots of this, in the recent past decades, but then also, how this has everything to do with the founding of this country on the basis of slavery, the outcome of the Civil War, and where we are today at this very, very acute and anguishing moment for people, but we have to act. And the scholars strike, I think, set a good example of people moving quickly, right? You gave the story of the tweet and the meeting, of minds, in very short order to call an action, on campus, the teach-in movement, the events that took place in response to the horrible police murder of Jacob Blake, and the whole problem and the whole escalating assault on Black and brown lives and bodies. So, I think that was a very powerful example and impetus for people to go forward right now in the face of what we are, confronting. I just wanted, before we signed off, just to call on people to support Revolution Books. We do programs like these, and I think people can appreciate, the need and the incredible resource that Revolution Books represents, because it's not simply a bookstore. It is, the political, intellectual, and cultural center of a movement for a revolution. We like to say it's a beacon for a whole new world at a time when Trump hence fascism must be stopped. And at this bookstore, we have the kinds of discussions we're having with Professor Anthea Butler, learning from her scholarship, engaging, with her work, and bringing others, into this experience and into this discussion. This is a place where people bring their toughest questions, their understanding, and we grapple together to understand why the world is the way it is and how it can be changed through revolution. And this is a bookstore that values critical thinking, the poetic spirit, and the search for the truth. And as I said, the beating heart of this bookstore is this whole new framework for human emancipation, the new communism developed by Bob Avakian, and the method and approach that he has brought forward so that we can understand the world deeply in order to transform it radically and to make this revolution to change everything. So I call on people, I urge people to support Revolution Books. We count on you. Your support, keeps us going, your ideas, your involvement. And people can donate through revolutionbooksnyc.org. They can do it through Venmo at RevBooksNYC. They can do it at Cash App at $RevBooksNYC. And people can donate, they can become sustainers, and your donation will make it possible for us to recover from some of the losses. You were mentioning the pandemic. We had to shut down for a period of time. We want to restock our shelves. We want to promote and amplify the kinds of programs we're having tonight, which are so essential to people understanding the world and being able to change it. And at this crucial moment, confronting the enormity and acting on the challenge before us, which is to drive this regime from power. So I ask people to make a donation, to let people know about Revolution Books, post us on your Instagram, tell your friends, your colleagues, students, and the professors. And Anthea, I want to thank you for this wonderful conversation, for your sharing your experience. And I want to let people know again about your forthcoming book that'll be coming out in the spring of 2021. That's White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, and Reading Race, How Publishing Created a Lifeline for Black Baptists in Post-Reconstruction America. Those books will be available at Revolution Books, both in the store and online. As I said, we're going to have you back to talk about that book. And if you'd like to say some parting words, please do so.
I'm just going to say it like everybody else would have said in the 60s, fight the power.
Cool.
That's all I can say is, keep your head up, because the election day is not over. It's not going to be over after the 3rd. So we need to stay vigilant.
Right. And stay vigilant and be in the streets and stay in the streets. And I'm going to sign off.